Hello everyone. This is Daniel Smith, and um, this ongoing conflict between Mexico and America is baffling. I just want you guys to have an
Do not
inside
come.
look on everything I'm
And if
saying.
they come back
Thank you. Enjoy it.
into our country, they will be told it is an automatic 10-year sentence in jail with no possibility of parole.
In recent elections, it's become a hot-button issue. Illegal immigration has made the southern border a lightning rod for fiery political debate in the U.S. And a majority of Americans say the issue will inform how they vote. But what's at stake for countries south of the U.S. border? How might a Trump or Harris immigration policy impact their neighbors in Latin America and beyond? Today, we have another special pre-election report looking at America's place in the world ahead of the election. And with me is Bernd de Busman, who is covering the election and immigration for our digital team here in DC. And at this point, Bernie, I think it's fair to say you're a pretty familiar voice on this podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
And we also have sitting next to me here, Will Grant, the BBC's Mexico, Central America, and Cuba correspondent, who usually speaks to us from Mexico City, but we're lucky to have you much closer in DC.
It's nice to see you again, Sumi.
Bernie, I want to start with you because immigration is a political issue in many countries. But when we're talking about the U.S., this election in 2024, we know voters say immigration is important, but how important? I mean, where does it sit among the issues on the list?
Well, it's certainly among the most important issues of this electoral cycle. Now, there's polls showing that overall economics and kind of pocketbook issues are far and away the most important issue for most voters, but still across the board, it's one of the first things that voters mention. And more unscientifically, when I'm at rallies, particularly Republican rallies, it's almost always either the first or second thing that voters talk about when I ask them what matters to them.
How did we get here, Bernie? I mean, has immigration always been a hot topic in U.S. politics?
Well, it certainly has for decades. Even as far back as Reagan, immigration reform was kind of a very considerable issue. But I think we've seen more and more of it since Trump first entered the kind of national political stage.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
So it's certainly something that we've seen more and more of. And I think in the last 4 years in particular, we've seen it kind of become one of the primary policy issues for the Trump campaign.
Yeah, tell us about those last 4 years, because it really is reflected in the data, isn't it? I mean, the number of people trying to reach the United States has gone up pretty significantly.
It has, and we started seeing that kind of in 2020 and 2021 towards the beginning of the pandemic. So we start to see numbers kind of start to climb, and the number of detentions at the border start to climb. Eventually we got to a high of about 250,000 detentions in a month in December of 23, which was the highest ever recorded. Those numbers have dropped quite significantly over the course of the year. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. There's been changes to how the U.S. is handling these people at the border. There's more legal pathways and also kind of stricter penalties for crossing the border illegally. But also, as Will can attest to, Mexican authorities in particular have cracked down at the U.S.'s request on the flow of migrants headed up to the border. So we've seen actually now kind of the lowest numbers of the Biden administration over the last few months.
Well, you're usually based in Mexico City. You cover Central and Latin America for the BBC. Bernie touched on this, but what was happening in these years that led to this large number of people trying to cross into the U.S.?
Well, I think there's a variety of factors. You found at one point that the majority of people coming through Mexico were from Central America, particularly Honduras, where they were fleeing gang violence. They were fleeing very low wages, very, very low wages, maybe just a handful of dollars a day. On top of that, and I think we saw this maybe 2018 to sort of through the pandemic and so on. Venezuelans were leaving in huge numbers. The conditions in Venezuela were very, very bad. And we saw somewhere in the region of 5 million Venezuelans leave in a sort of 4-year period.
5 million?
Yeah, it was something around the region of 20% of their population. So shocking numbers of people leaving Venezuela, an exodus really. Similarly, Cubans were leaving when the economic downturn there kicked in very hard around the pandemic. We've seen somewhere in the region of 10% of Cuba's population leave the island over the past 5 or 6 years.
How is the issue of immigration seen in those countries? Do they understand, for example, the people who are arriving in the U.S., what a political issue it's become here?
There are different opinions and different takes from the different countries. For example, a lot of people from those Central American nations I was mentioning are aware that, yes, it was a political issue. Yes, Donald Trump was using very, very negative rhetoric against them. But they were saying, kind of, what else are we supposed to do? I have to feed my family. I have to be safe. They know that they are a political issue and that they are prominent in voters' minds around an election, but they also believe that they should be given a chance to make it to the US and contribute to society and be able to send some money home.
Bernie, let's talk about that contribution, the actual impact of immigration in the U.S. For example, economically, what role has it played over the years?
The narrative has for a long time been that immigrants would come and take American jobs, or that immigrants are somehow a burden on federal resources. But when you look at the statistics, it's actually quite different. Now, today, as things stand, immigrants make up about 19% of the U.S. workforce. And generally, including undocumented immigrants, they all pay taxes. So in total, between local, state, and federal taxes, it's something about $525 billion they contribute in tax money every year.
I want to ask you about one piece of that rhetoric, because we've heard Donald Trump and Republicans often make the link between immigrants and crime. So, Bernie, what do we actually know about the veracity of that link?
Well, that's something we've seen a lot recently. In particular this year, there's been a number of high-profile crimes committed by undocumented migrants that the Republicans often bring up in campaign speeches. Actual statistics kind of show that undocumented immigrants in this country actually commit crimes at a lower rate than U.S. citizens.
One point I was going to make is that, for example, in Venezuela, crime has reduced as a result of this exodus. And I think also the Trump campaign is trying to sort of use that piece of information to say, look, crime's going down in Caracas, ergo, they're bringing it here. The truth of the matter is that a lot of the people, the young people who were perhaps involved in crime or were part of criminal organizations in Venezuela or Central America, aren't necessarily making it to the United States, particularly in the Venezuelan example. They're going to other Andean nations.
Tell us a bit about Donald Trump's track record on immigration. What did he actually do when he was in the White House?
His big campaign promise was building the wall.
The Secretary of Homeland Security, working with myself and my staff, will begin immediate construction of a border wall.
Now, he did improve, substantial portions of the barrier between the U.S. and Mexico, but in terms of actual new wall building, he built about only 50 miles of it. He still, to this day, though, he said he built hundreds of miles of it. At the time, the U.S. government was much more active in terms of going after people who are already in the country. For example, under his administration, there was much more workplace raids against companies that may have been hiring undocumented workers. During the pandemic, Trump passed legislation, or reintroduced rather, a law that made it much easier to expedite people leaving the country very quickly if they were found to be crossing illegally, Title 42.
What about Kamala Harris's track record? She had a few roles dealing with immigration, including California Attorney General and dealing with the border for the Biden administration.
We're starting to see her kind of point to her record as a prosecutor, for example, prosecuting transnational drug cartels that move drugs from Mexico to the U.S., people smuggling networks, all these kind of bogeymen of the border that are brought up so often in Republican rallies. We're starting to see her kind of tout her credentials, fighting that a little more. Now, more recently, she's also been tasked with kind of looking at some of the structural issues that brought people from Central America, as Will said, to the United States. And in that, she has a much harder time pointing to hard success, but we are starting to see her kind of embrace this image as being tough on the border, even if that makes some Democrats uncomfortable. And in some ways, she's perhaps harsher than many people would like.
And Bernd, looking ahead to what Donald Trump says he would do on immigration if he were to be president again, what specific policies is he talking about?
Now, besides building, again, a strong border, and, we've seen him time and time again kind of refer back to the promises of a border wall, which became so famous in his first presidential campaign. They've also promised mass deportations of as many as 10 million people from across the country. He's suggested using the National Guard and enlisting their help to kind of find these people and detain them before deportation. Now, whether or not that's realistic is debatable. There's a lot of suggestion and a lot of data to show that even if he wanted to deport 10 million people, there's nowhere to house them at the moment. Lots of local jurisdictions probably wouldn't necessarily cooperate with that, which they would need to make that happen.
That would have a staggering impact on the countries where many of these migrants come from.
I mean, the importance of remittances in so many economies, let's just take Cuba, it really is one of the mainstays alongside tourism. And particularly with the sort of difficulties that some of the traditional industries in Cuba, tobacco, sugar, are in now. So you take away the element or a significant chunk of what's sent back to the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and it would be very, very noticeable. Mexico alone. To be perfectly honest, when I speak to people coming through Mexico, there is very little that will actually deter them. They are planning to make it to the United States. They're thankful of some of the more legal pathways that have been opened by the Biden administration. They don't really want to travel on the roofs of trains or risk their life and limb to get to the United States, but they do want to get there. And if that is the only way to get there, they will take those more risky journeys instead.
If people still feel compelled to leave their countries of origin, but it's much harder to get into the U.S., what does that mean then for the transit countries in between?
It tends to push people into the arms of illegal organizations. It tends to mean that they're going to continue to try, but they know that they won't have a safe way to get there. So they will try any which way they can. We've seen those numbers reduce because people have other options at the moment. So I think if there's serious proposals on the table by Donald Trump, he ends up winning the election to end some of those things. You can imagine that for the new administration in Mexico, for example, under Claudia Sheinbaum, who's just taken over from Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that presents an immediate headache for her new administration.
Tell us a bit more about Kamala Harris. If she were to win and enter the White House, what is she saying that she would do on immigration?
Now, she's taking kind of a two-pronged approach as far as her policy. I mean, on one hand, she also wants to kind of strengthen the border and kind of penalize and make it much more difficult for unregulated crossers to cross between points of entry, for example, and make that kind of take away the incentive for crossing illegally and rather push people to come in legally. She also kind of vowed to wrap up what wasn't possible during the Biden administration in terms of passing that sort of bipartisan border security bill.
And so even though Donald Trump tried to sabotage the border security bill, it is my pledge to you that as President of the United States, I will bring it back up and proudly sign it into law.
Ultimately, what she wants to see is more regulated immigration and also kind of the normalization of many people who are already in the country, some of whom have been here for decades. So you're seeing kind of, I would call it kind of a carrot and stick approach to her campaign vows in terms of immigration, for sure.
Will, what is the sense among countries to America's south? I mean, do they want to see a certain type of policy towards immigration? What are they expecting on immigration policies?
I mean, I think there is a certain tiredness at hearing the negative rhetorics. So they hear, and I'm talking about the populations rather than perhaps the governments, the words coming from the Trump campaign, and they know they've been here before, and they, it's very it very much underlines that they're not welcome. I think they're certainly among the populations and a number of the governments, they would like things that recognize America's role in creating some of the conditions in the countries in question, particularly in Central America. Washington's role in Central America has made life extremely difficult during the 1980s and 90s. I'm thinking particularly during the civil wars of backing right-wing militias and things like this that have left their mark on many of these nations and have struggled to pick themselves up afterwards. And it goes back, beyond that. So a sense in which the migrant labor force is important to the US, and in return, Washington should help the countries of origin of that migrant labor force.
Bernie, would either of the candidates, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, be in line with what Will is describing here, which is more help and aid and economic development for America's neighbors to the south?
Harris had the task of kind of looking at some of those push issues rather than pull issues in Central America and Latin America. So I think, you would see much more willingness to kind of help at source from the Democrats. Now, that's not really something that the Trump campaign or the previous Trump administration really addressed in any sort of detail, is the factors pushing people out of places like Honduras, like Venezuela. Ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever else is done in terms of policy, as long as there's still factors pushing people out of those countries, they're still going to come to the United States, because there's also the pull factor, which is very simply that they can make more money in the United States than they can at home. So there's always going to be that kind of incentive.
Is there a feeling in Latin America and Central America who would make a better partner to the region?
Depends a little bit which nations we're talking about. I mean, you think about El Salvador, for example, a nation that for many years has seen net outward migration. Well, now they've clamped down under President Bukele on the gang issue in that nation so heavily that really gang crime has largely been eradicated. And he is a very close bedfellow, I think, with Donald Trump, and would clearly prefer a Trump presidency. Of course, I think Claudia Sheinbaum would probably make a better fit with Kamala Harris just on policy, because while she told me when we were on the campaign trail and I was able to speak to her, I can work with either of them and I'll fight for Mexico's interests. The truth of it is a lot more exhausting. It's harder to work perhaps with a Trump presidency that tends to do things like link trade to migration.
Are any of these policies that we're discussing likely to have a real lasting impact on immigration to the U.S.?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's a lot of factors in this immigration debate that as we've discussed, that are kind of well beyond the reach of the U.S. government. There could be, for example, political instability or natural disasters or economic disasters in Latin America that would push people north, and ultimately that's something the U.S. would have to contend with. But both parties and voters from both parties that I've spoken to are quite set in that overall there needs to be a much more wider reaching reform rather than just being reactive to pushes and flows at the border.
Bernie's just touched on one point there that I don't think we've really mentioned, which is climate change. And I think the fact that will be such a huge push factor, I think, in the coming years. I mean, it's already so obvious in this hurricane season.
That brings us to our last question. And Bernie, I'll start with you. Is immigration still going to be a hot button issue when America chooses its next president in 2028?
Even if there is some sort of meaningful immigration reform in the next 4 years, I don't see any scenario in which immigration isn't a political hot topic here. Just, you look at the number of immigrants in this country, and more importantly, you look at the number of people abroad in Central and South America, for example, that still would want to come to this country. I just don't see how any of those issues get addressed in 4 years.
Without wanting just to simply echo what Bernie's saying, I do agree that this is not an issue that's going to go away. It will always be, I think, part of politics in the US. So yeah, these are global flows and trends that I don't think are going to end within a short period of time.
Fascinating discussion. Will, Bernie, thank you both so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
If you want more episodes of The Global Story, you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Each day, we dive deep into a single story, bringing you analysis from around the world. Subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching The Global Story, and goodbye.